What would you do if your whole life was sold for $40? The morning sun stretched over Cedar Falls, a dusty frontier town holding on to the last shreds of hope. It was the year of the Great Drought, 1873, when crops turned to dust, families lost their land, and pride was sold cheaper than grain. On that morning, 19-year-old Sarah Ann O'Connell stood on a wooden platform outside the general store, her thin hands trembling, her eyes fixed on the ground. Before her stood a crowd, men, women, children, some curious, some pitying, and some ready to buy. The auctioneer, Silas Weatherby, wiped his brow and cleared his throat. Even he looked uneasy, but not enough to refuse his pay. "Gentlemen," quote, he called out, voice carrying over the square. "We commenced this morning with the arranged marriage auction." A silence fell. Sarah could feel every stare burning into her back. Her mother stood near the edge of the crowd, crying softly into a faded handkerchief. Her father, once a proud man, stared straight ahead, his face carved in stone. The farm was gone, the debts were heavy, and now this, their daughter for sale. Silas opened his ledger and spoke again, Miss Sarah Ann O'Connell. 19 years of age, can read and write, knows her numbers and household duties. The family seeks $40 to pay their debts and travel west to California. $40, the price of her family's hope and her own freedom. 30, called a man near the front, a shopkeeper known for working his wife into an early grave. 35. Came another voice, rough and slurred, belonging to a gray-bearded miner. Then a voice deeper, colder, cut through the crowd. 40 heads turned. The crowd parted as a tall man stepped forward. Ezekiel Boon, the name spread in whispers. A mountain man. A recluse, a widower who came down from the Rockies only twice a year. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with storm-gray eyes and a face hardened by wind and grief. The sun caught the silver in his dark hair. There was something dangerous about him, the kind of man who spoke little and meant every word. $40. Weatherby repeated, almost relieved. "Do I hear 45? No one answered. "Sold to Mr. Boon." The word "sold" hit Sarah like a blow. The crowd murmured as Ezekiel Boon stepped forward, pulling a small leather pouch from his coat. He counted out real gold coins, not paper, not promises. Then he looked at Sarah. "Get your things," he said, voice rough as gravel. "We leave within the hour." Her legs shook as she stepped down from the platform. Her mother ran to her, clutching her tight. "My sweet girl, may the Blessed Virgin protect you." Her father placed something in her hand, her grandmother's rosary. His voice cracked as he whispered, "You're an O'Connell. Remember that." "Papa," she began, but he turned away. Sarah's few possessions fit in a single canvas bag: a Bible, a worn dress, a brush, a sewing kit, and a photo of her family. When she stepped outside, Ezekiel was waiting with a wagon and a team of oxen. He took her bag without a word. "You know how to drive a team?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "Then drive." "I don't ride in wagons." He mounted his black horse and rode beside her as they left Cedar Falls. Behind them, her parents grew smaller, until they were just two figures swallowed by dust. Before the wagon disappeared from view, her mother's voice broke through one last time. "Please be kind to her, Mr. Boon. She's a good girl, pure and innocent." "She's never." Boon turned in the saddle. "Madam," he said flatly, "I bought her for one purpose only, to bear my children and continue my line. Whether she cries or not makes no difference to me. Only my heirs matter." The words stabbed like a knife. Her mother gasped and staggered back. Sarah froze, tears burning in her eyes. She gripped the reins tighter, forcing herself not to cry. She would not give him that satisfaction. The road stretched ahead, leading into the wild. Endless plains, tall grass, and the faint shadow of mountains in the distance. The wagon wheels creaked a mournful rhythm as they left behind the last traces of civilization. Ezekiel rode silently beside her, his expression unreadable. To him, she was no more than another necessity, like flour, coffee, or salt, a woman to work, to breed, to give him the heirs his first wife hadn't lived long enough to bear. By noon, the heat was merciless. Sweat ran down Sarah's back, and dust clung to her face. She wanted to stop, to drink, but pride held her tongue. She wouldn't show weakness. When the sun burned highest, Ezekiel finally raised his hand. "We stop here," he said, dismounting near a creek. Sarah climbed down, legs stiff, and led the oxen to water. The cool stream soothed her burning skin. From her bag she took a piece of cornbread, her mother's last gift, and ate in silence. "Storm's coming," Ezekiel said suddenly, his gray eyes scanning the sky. She looked up, confused. The horizon was clear, but within an hour, dark clouds rolled in fast. The wind howling through the trees moved them faster. Boon commanded, "We've got maybe 2 hours." The rain struck hard. By the time they reached a small way station, the storm was a roaring wall of wind and lightning. They barely got the animals into the corral before the heavens opened completely. Inside the rough log cabin, Sarah's hands shook as she built a fire. Boon hung his dripping coat and began unpacking supplies. His movements were sure, practiced. He looked like a man who'd lived 100 storms like this. When she finally got a fire going, warmth filled the space, and for a moment, Sarah allowed herself to breathe. Boon cooked beans and salt pork while thunder rolled outside. They ate in silence, sitting across the flames from each other, strangers bound by circumstance. When the meal was done, Boon spread his bedroll by the fire and tossed her an old blanket. "We leave at first light." Sarah lay awake on the far side of the fire, listening to the storm, the crackle of flames, the deep rhythm of his breathing. Every sound in the dark made her heart race. "The wolves won't come in," Boon said suddenly, his voice low. "They smell humans and keep clear." She hadn't realized he was awake. "I've never slept outside before," she admitted quietly. "You'll get used to it," he said, "or you won't." Silence fell again. Sarah stared into the fire. 3 days to the mountains, he'd said. 3 days to the cabin where she would live as his wife, in name, but not in heart. 3 days to the life that would test her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. But as the storm raged and the thunder echoed over the mountains, Sarah whispered a promise to herself. "I might be bought, but I won't be broken." Tomorrow, she told herself, she would be stronger. She had to be. Morning broke clear and sharp after the storm. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, and the mountains stood closer now, blue and misty under the rising sun. Sarah woke to find Ezekiel already outside, saddling his horse. He moved like a man born to the wilderness. Silent, steady, and utterly sure of himself. He handed her a cup of hot coffee when she stepped out. "Drink up," he said. "We've got a long road ahead." Quote. She thanked him quietly, surprised by the small gesture, though his tone held no warmth. By now, she'd learned that kindness from him was rare, and silence was safer than words. They traveled through the morning, following the narrow trail that climbed steadily toward the mountains. The land grew wilder with every mile. Thick forests, steep ridges, and rivers that ran cold and fast. The wagon creaked and groaned, and the oxen struggled through muddy patches left by the storm. At midday, they stopped near a meadow where a stream wound like silver between the rocks. Sarah tended the oxen while Ezekiel checked his rifle and studied the sky again. The weather mattered to him. She could tell he read the land the way other men read books. They ate a simple meal in silence. Sarah noticed a small scar on his hand as he broke bread, a deep white line running across his knuckles. She wondered how he'd gotten it, but didn't ask. Questions, she'd learned, only earned cold answers. That night, they camped beneath a ridge, building a small fire sheltered by overhanging rocks. As the flames flickered, Ezekiel spoke without looking at her. 3 more days if the weather holds. Maybe 4. And after that, she asked. After that, you'll learn what work looks like in the high country. He spread his bedroll, turning his back to her. Sarah lay awake long after he slept, staring at the stars through the gaps in the rocks. The wilderness was vast, endless. Out here, No one would hear her if she screamed. No one would even know she existed. Yet deep inside her heart, something whispered that she would not disappear so easily. She would survive this, whatever it took. The next day they climbed higher still, the air cooler and the sky a brilliant blue. By the third evening, the land opened into a hidden valley surrounded by towering peaks. And there, tucked against the forest edge, stood a cabin. It was solid and well built, with smoke curling from the chimney. A barn, a chicken coop, and a garden surrounded it. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress, built to withstand whatever the wilderness could throw at it. Ezekiel's voice broke the silence. "We're here." Sarah's throat tightened. The place looked beautiful but lonely. As they stopped in the yard, a young man stepped from the barn. Native American by his features, no older than 17. He nodded respectfully. "Mr. Boon." "Everything's ready like you said. The stew's on the pot." "Good. This is my wife, Sarah." Ezekiel said, "Sarah, this is Jacob Two Rivers. Helps out when I'm gone, wife." The word startled her. She wasn't sure if it was truth or convenience, but she said nothing. Jacob tipped his hat politely. "Ma'am, hello," she answered softly. After they unloaded the wagon, Ezekiel dismissed the boy for the season, then turned to Sarah. "Come inside." The cabin's interior surprised her. Rough, but clean. Everything neatly arranged. Pots hanging by the fireplace. Shelves lined with jars and books. A sturdy table. A curtained alcove with a real bed. There was even a ladder leading up to a small loft. "Your things go up there," Ezekiel said. She climbed the ladder and found a straw mattress, a chest, and a tiny window overlooking the forest. It was plain but private, and after days on the trail it felt almost like a blessing. That night they ate rabbit stew and bread she baked herself. The silence between them was heavy but not hostile. Ezekiel seemed deep in thought, as if measuring what kind of woman she might turn out to be. After supper, he showed her around the smokehouse, the root cellar, the spring that fed clear water to a stone basin. Everything had its place, built with care. "There's no town within 50 miles. He told her. "No law, but what we make. You get lost, you die. You get hurt, you die. You cross the wrong animal, you die. Understand?" Sarah swallowed hard. "I understand." "Good." He looked at her for a long moment. "When the first snow comes, we'll be alone for months. Can you handle that?" She lifted her chin. "I'll have to, won't I?" A flicker, maybe approval, passed across his face. "Yes," he said finally, "you will." That night, from her loft, Sarah watched him through the flicker of firelight as he mended a harness, quiet and focused. When he noticed her gaze, he said simply, "Bar the shutters at night." Bears get curious sometimes. "Yes, Mr. Boon." His eyes lifted briefly to the rosary in her hands. "You pray. Yes, pray all you want. Just remember, God's not coming to help with the chores." Then he went to his bed and turned away. Sarah stared into the fire, her hands tightening around the rosary. "Maybe God won't help with chores," she thought, "but he can help me keep my soul in this wild place." Days turned to weeks. Life in the mountains demanded everything she had. Each morning she rose before dawn, tended the fire, milked the cows, and fed the chickens. The work was endless, but so was the quiet. Boon spoke little, though sometimes his silence seemed less cruel and more cautious, like a man afraid of breaking something fragile. By late September, the air turned cold. The first snow came early, soft, white, and silent. "Everything changes now," Ezekiel said as he checked his traps and covered the windows. And everything did. Winter closed around them like an iron door. No more visits from Jacob, no travelers, just the two of them. One cabin, one fire, and the endless wind outside. At first, the silence between them grew heavier than the snow on the roof. Sarah busied herself with chores, but loneliness clawed at her heart. Finally, one night as they sat by the fire, she asked quietly, "What do you think about when you sit there so long and don't speak?" He looked up slowly. "Nothing you'd want to hear. Try me." He hesitated, then said, "I think about the roof, the meat in the smokehouse, the traps. And sometimes I think about before, your wife," she asked gently. His jaw tightened. "Mary. And my little girl, Lizzie Sarah, said nothing. The fever took them," he went on after a long pause. "2 days. Nothing I could do. No doctor close enough to help." His voice was raw, the kind of pain that never truly healed. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered. "Don't want pity," he muttered. "Just facts. I need heirs. That's all." But later that night, he left something on the table. A small wooden sewing box filled with colored threads and a silver thimble. "Mary's," he said shortly. No sense letting it go to waste. Sarah touched the smooth silver, her heart aching. For the first time, she saw more than hardness in him. Beneath the silence and the scars, there was sorrow, deep and lonely. Outside, the snow fell heavier, sealing them into their mountain world. Inside, by the fire's glow, something fragile began to thaw between them. Not love yet, but understanding. And in that frozen wilderness, understanding was the first sign of warmth. The winter of 1873 was cruel, the kind that tested both bone and spirit. Snow lay thick on the mountains, sealing Sarah and Ezekiel inside their cabin for weeks at a time. Each morning began the same, breaking ice for water, feeding the animals, and keeping the fire from dying. At first, they barely spoke. The silence pressed down heavier than the snow on the roof. But slowly, little by little, that began to change. One night, when the wind howled outside like a lost soul, Sarah read aloud from a tattered book she'd found on his shelf. Robinson Crusoe. Her soft voice filled the cabin with a kind of peace the place hadn't known in years. Ezekiel listened quietly, his eyes on the fire, his rough hands still. When she finished the chapter, he said, almost to himself, "That's what it feels like. The wilderness. Like being the last man on earth." "But Crusoe survived," Sarah said gently. "He made a life, even alone." He looked at her then, eyes gray and deep as the storm outside. He had Friday. He said someone to talk to. Sarah met his gaze. "You're not alone anymore, Ezekiel." That night marked a change neither of them fully understood. The walls of silence that had stood between them began to crack. Days passed. They worked side by side, repairing tools, tending the animals, melting snow for water. Ezekiel showed her how to track small game, how to read the weather from the clouds. She learned fast, earning quiet nods of approval that meant more than words ever could. But then came the blizzard, 5 days of roaring wind that buried the world in white. On the third day, a crash shook the ground. The barn roof had caved in the animals. Sarah gasped. "I'll handle it," Ezekiel said, already pulling on his coat. "You stay inside." He tied a rope around his waist and vanished into the storm. The wind swallowed him whole. An hour passed. Then another. The rope went slack. Fear gripped Sarah's chest. What if he was hurt? Or worse? She wrapped herself in every blanket she could find and followed the rope into the storm. Snow whipped at her face. She could barely breathe, barely see. The barn loomed out of the white like a ghost. Inside, the cows were panicking, the air thick with steam and fear. And there, half buried under a fallen beam, lay Ezekiel. "Ezekiel!" she cried, dropping beside him. Blood ran from a cut on his forehead. He was unconscious, but breathing. With shaking hands, she dragged him free, inch by inch, praying under her breath. Back in the cabin, she tore strips from her petticoat to bandage his head and fed him broth when he would wake only long enough to mumble. Fever followed, 3 endless days of delirium. He called out names: Mary, Lizzie, people from another life. Once, he gripped her hand and whispered, "Don't leave. Everyone leaves." "I'm not going anywhere," Sarah said softly. "You're safe. I'm here." When his fever finally broke, dawn light touched the mountains, turning the snow to gold. Ezekiel woke weak but clear-eyed and found her asleep in the chair beside him, still holding his hand. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "You would have done the same," she replied, not meeting his eyes. "No." He said, "I mean it. You could have left me out there. Been free." Sarah looked at him, startled. "And let you die? That's not the kind of freedom I want." Something in his expression softened, something she hadn't seen before. Gratitude, and maybe something more. As he healed, their days fell into rhythm again, but everything felt different. They spoke more now, laughed even. He showed her how to repair harness leather. She taught him how to bake bread with less flour. And one night, as they played checkers by firelight, he said quietly, "After Mary and Lizzie died, I stopped talking to God. Stopped talking to anyone. But you made this place feel alive again." She smiled faintly. "Maybe it's time to start living again." Ezekiel. By spring, the snow melted. Streams ran free and the valley burst into color. Wildflowers carpeted the fields. Birds sang again. The world felt reborn, and so did they. One morning, Ezekiel brought out a small wooden box. Inside was a simple gold ring. "I had Jacob fetch this from town last fall," he said, voice rough with emotion. "Didn't know who I'd bring back, but I figured I'd need it someday. You stayed when you could have run. You saved me when you could have let me die. You've earned the right to be my wife proper. Not because I bought you. Because I choose you." Tears stung Sarah's eyes. "Then ask me," she whispered. "Ask me like a man, not a buyer." He took a breath. "Sarah, Ann O'Connell, will you be my wife? Real and true." She smiled through her tears. "Yes, Ezekiel Boon. I will." They were married that summer, under the clear mountain sky, with Jacob and his family as witnesses. It was simple. No preacher, no fancy dress. But to Sarah, it was the truest ceremony she could imagine. Seasons turned. They built a life together, working the land, sharing quiet laughter, and reading by the fire. When Sarah's belly began to swell with their first child, Ezekiel built a cradle from pine, carving it with care. "You're afraid," she said softly one night, watching him work. He nodded. "Terrified, but grateful too. Never thought I'd get another chance." Spring came with new life. Their son, Thomas Patrick Boon, was born strong and healthy. Ezekiel wept openly as he held him. "You gave me back everything I thought was lost," he whispered. Months later, a federal marshal rode up the valley. Town gossip had reached the law. Some said their marriage wasn't real, that Sarah had been bought. She met the marshal on the porch, baby in her arms. "You want the truth," she said calmly. "I was sold once. But I stayed by choice. I'm his wife, not his property." The marshal nodded slowly, seeing the life they'd built. "That's all I needed to hear," he said, and rode away. That night, Sarah sat by the fire, writing a letter to her mother in California. "Dear Mother, you asked if I forgive you. I do. The man you sold me to has become the man I'd have chosen. The life I feared became the life I love. I was bought for $40, but I stayed for love. And I remain by choice." Ezekiel came in from the cold, their son asleep in his arms. "You writing to them?" he asked softly. "Yes," she said, smiling, "telling them I'm home." He kissed her gently. "So am I." Outside, snow began to fall, quiet, soft, and pure, covering the mountain cabin that now held warmth, family, and love, born from the hardest soil the world could offer. Because sometimes, in the Wild West, love doesn't begin with a kiss. It begins with a price and ends with a choice.